It's 1789, and France is in a state of turmoil. War with Britain and the funding of the American Revolution has placed the country in massive debt. A population rife with inequality and poverty is about to explode, and within a few short months, the country will be changed forever. The people were split into three categories, or estates. The first and second estates paid little to no income tax. The third estate made up the majority of the population, but were taxed heavily. Adding to their frustration was the fact that tax rates varied from region to region. The country was on the brink of explosion. It just needed one more event to push it over the edge. And then it happened. A series of harsh summers and winters left the peasants' harvest in ruins. The cost of bread skyrocketed. The upper classes, with almost unlimited supplies, were not affected. The peasants, however, were on the brink of starvation. Rioting began in the cities. Bakeries were raided, and bakers, suspected of hoarding bread, were attacked and sometimes hanged. King Louis XVI, a weak and indecisive monarch, decided to tackle this situation by summoning the Estates General. The Estates General was the closest thing France had to a government, other than the king. Meant purely as an advisory board, it had not been called since 1614. It included representatives from the three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and everyone else. Despite representing approximately 98% of France's population, the third estate received one vote, the same as the clergy and nobility. Should they recommend any change that might inconvenience the first and second estates, like paying taxes for once, they would be outvoted 2-1. The third estate soon realized that any chances of reform would be immediately shut down. So they decided, why don't we create our own government instead? They formed the National Assembly, and there was nothing the clergy and the nobility could do about it. In retaliation, the king locked them out of their meeting place, so they found a new unlocked building. At an indoor tennis court on June 20th, 1789, the National Assembly members all took the tennis court oath, where they pledged to continue to meet until the king accepted their demands for equality and economic reform. The new National Assembly included many highly educated members of the Third Estate, including two young lawyers, Maximilien Robespierre and Georges Danton. Some members of the First and Second Estates even joined. Some of these men formed a radical political party, the Jacobin Club. They sought not only reform, but the abolition of the monarchy altogether. Other members of the National Assembly, while also demanding reform, wanted to keep the monarchy. Once word reached Louis, he decided to fortify the streets of Paris with troops. The National Assembly feared they would be arrested, or worse, executed. To make matters worse, Louis had just dismissed the popular finance minister, who was trying to make reforms himself. The people of Paris, fearing reprisals from the king, and after decades of inequality, hardship, and starvation, decided to arm themselves. The National Assembly created their bourgeois militia, the National Guard. Several members of the king's army soon defected. In the early hours of July 14th, 1789, a large crowd raided a military hospital, the Hôtel des Invalides, where they hoped to find guns. Instead, they found only patients, so they went to the next best place, a large fortress and symbol of royal tyranny, the Bastille. The crowd soon gathered around the Bastille and demanded that the man in charge, Governor Delaunay, immediately hand over weapons and gunpowder. While initially telling the crowd to get lost, he eventually invited some members of the National Guard inside to negotiate. This attempt to stall for time was unsuccessful. Shooting between soldiers of both sides broke out. Delaunay was killed, and his head mounted on a spike and paraded around the streets of Paris. The majority of the National Assembly were pleased with these events, and it is speculated by historians that this approval paved the way for the fear and violence of the French Revolution. These fears were escalated by the writings of a man called Jean-Paul Marat. He created his radical newspaper titled The Friend of the People. including calls to execute members of the nobility before they kill members of the Third Estate first. It became one of the most popular publications in France, and succeeded in spreading more fear and anger amongst the people. A certain Thomas Jefferson even joined in, meeting with the National Assembly in August, creating the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document that guaranteed liberty and equal rights for all men. Back on the streets of Paris, however, people were less concerned with the struggle for equality and more concerned with the struggle against starvation. The price of bread was skyrocketing and very scarce. The king, however, locked himself away in his palace at Versailles, some 20 kilometers outside of Paris. He had no such concerns. On October 5th, some 7,000 people decided to do something about it, and marched on the palace. Upon arrival, they demanded an audience with Louis, and he reluctantly agreed to share power with the new revolutionary government. The king found himself with little choice but to go along with their demands to finally tax the nobility. But by 1791, he felt the situation was rapidly turning against him. He decided to leave the country and try to retake it from abroad. Luckily for him, he was married to an Austrian princess, Marie Antoinette. So, on the evening of June 20th, 1791, the king and his family disguised themselves as servants and tried to leave for the Austrian Netherlands. They didn't get very far. Stopping at the town of Varennes, he was apprehended and swiftly returned to Paris. Back in Paris, many in the government now considered Louis a traitor who tried to abandon his people. The resulting Constitution of 1791 completely reduced his power to that of a constitutional monarch, a total figurehead. However, radicals, especially the Jacobins, were outraged that the king was not removed from power entirely. A month later, they staged a protest at the Champ de Mars, calling for the king's removal. The government feared an insurrection was brewing, so they sent the military to disperse the crowd. The confrontation escalated, and the Revolutionary National Guard fired on the crowd. It was a massacre. Up to 50 people were killed. Men, women, and even children. One form of equality brought by the revolution was equality of execution. Gone were the days of inhumane, slow punishment such as hanging, drawing, and quartering. They wanted all criminals, regardless of economic status, to receive the same penalty, a quick and painless one. Luckily, a man named Dr. Joseph Guillotine had come up with a solution that would come to be known as the National Razor. A heavy blade falls, and the head rolls. The guillotine made its debut in 1791. The writings of Marat continued to call for the execution of anyone that stood in the way of the revolution. Several aristocrats in neighboring nations saw what was happening in France and didn't like what they saw. They feared these revolutionary ideas would take hold and be used against them. The National Assembly, now the Legislative Assembly, feared these nations would attack France, and decided to attack them first. In April of 1792, France declared war on Austria. Their ally Prussia soon joined in, and France was humiliated. In the streets of Paris, people stormed the king's palace, but Louis escaped to what he thought was the safety of the Legislative Assembly. There, Robespierre and the Jacobins voted to strip the king of his crown and imprison him. A month later, the newly established National Convention officially declared the French Republic, and things were about to change. The new republic began to remove any semblance of the old royalist regime. The church became a prime target. Priests that refused to take an oath to the republic were deported or arrested. A new state-sponsored atheistic religion known as the Cult of Reason was established as a replacement for the Catholic Church. Even the calendar was replaced with a new revolutionary calendar. The government of Paris, now under control of the radical sans-culottes, began to arrest supposed enemies of the revolution by the thousands. A large number of those arrested were members of the clergy and aristocracy. Georges Danton called for the Republic to be defended from foreign invaders, sending thousands of troops from Paris to the front lines. The people of Paris feared the prisons, now teeming with clergy and nobility, would become a breeding ground for counter-revolution. If the Prussians took Paris, they would surely free the aristocrats and take revenge upon the revolutionaries. The people broke into the prisons, and during the September massacres of 1792, over 1,600 people, including women and children, were tried and executed on the spot. But there was one man above all else that Robespierre wanted dead. The former King Louis was put on trial for treason and found guilty. Although many in the government wanted Louis to be exiled, Robespierre insisted upon execution. It was put to a vote, and by a majority of 1, Louis was sent to the guillotine. By May of 1793, Robespierre's radicals were in total control of the government, after arresting the moderate members of the National Convention. With France surrounded by foreign enemies, he believed there were many enemies of the revolution within the country too. And so began the Reign of Terror. A 12-man Committee of Public Safety, headed by Robespierre, was created, and the previously suspended Revolutionary Tribunal reinstated. Its purpose was trying suspected enemies and handing out their death sentences. Spies and secret police were everywhere, and watched the people closely. The French public had to be extremely careful with what they said and how they behaved. Criticizing the system, displaying sympathy for the monarchy, or any action deemed counter-revolutionary would get you sent to the guillotine. All across France, about 40,000 people were executed. The most prominent victim of the Reign of Terror was Marie Antoinette. She was brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal, convicted of treason, and executed on October 6, 1793. The following year, the number of executions reached an unprecedented level, during what is known as the Great Terror. Even those closest to Robespierre found themselves seriously dead if they dared to oppose his views or actions. His growing paranoia and bloodlust began to alienate him from the rest of the convention. He also created his own religion, the cult of the Supreme Being, which he intended as the new state religion, not surprisingly, with him as a god. This did not go down well with his fellow revolutionaries. On June 29, 1794, 3 members of the Committee of Public Safety condemned Robespierre as a dictator. He responded by telling the convention members that several of them were traitors and would be executed, but would not name names. Rather than wait to be arrested, the convention members decided to arrest Robespierre instead, and he was executed on July 28th. His supporters were arrested, the Jacobin Club closed, and the moderates took over the National Convention. A year later, a new constitution was adopted, re-establishing the Catholic Church and introducing elections for a new legislative body, the Directory. The Directory lasted until 1799, when a certain Napoleon Bonaparte led a coup, establishing himself as the first consul, effectively bringing the French Revolution to an end. The Napoleonic era was born, and Europe would be changed forever.